Hey you guys, welcome to week 4. So I hope that TED Talk kind of inspired you and got you thinking about how having limitations and having things that normal people might consider to be obstacles might actually spark creativity and make your artwork better. So this week you're going to be making some Plaster Craft figures. You should have gotten a bag of materials hopefully by now, and inside of the bag there is another bag where there is Plaster Craft. And what this is it's just a cotton gauze with plaster inside of the fibers. So if you've ever worked with like sheetrock or done any kind of plaster work, that's what's inside of here. One thing that you need to keep in mind is plaster, when it gets wet and then it dries, it stays that shape. So you want to be careful not to get your Plaster Craft wet until you're ready to start sculpting with it. You also want to make sure that it doesn't get put down your drains at home. So you'll need a container of water, which I'll show you in the video later. And what I did, I used an old yogurt container and then I let the water sit for a few hours, and the plaster will actually settle to the bottom and it'll harden, and then you can pour the water down your drain and you don't have to worry about getting plaster in your drains, which can cause a lot of plumbing issues. So just be aware of that. Another thing too is I had a student one time who had an allergic reaction to Plaster Craft. And so it wasn't a big deal. She just had like a rash on her hands that she got from it. But I do think it might be a good idea just to be aware that that does happen to some people. And if you notice it's irritating your skin at all while you're using it, you might want to stop and get some gloves and work with gloves from there. So you're going to be creating a figure. This is what my finished figure looks like here. I made him into a little yoga pose. You can create a human figure, or if you'd like, you can turn your figure into an animal or a fish or some other shape. And I'll show you how to do that in just a minute.
What you need before you begin is a container full of water. I like to use warm water, some newspaper underneath your work, plaster cut into strips. Make sure you cut enough because you don't want to run out while you're in the middle of working. Masking tape, your wire, and then also make sure that when you cut your plaster strips that you use the scissors that was included in your bag. First, you're going to take your wire and form it into the shape of your figure. So if you're doing a human figure, you're going to use a similar shape to what I use. If you're using a different figure, you're going to have to problem solve and figure out how to bend and twist your wire to get the right shape. This is called an armature. I think the trickiest part is figuring out how to bend and twist your wire so that you don't have to cut it. If you have a wire cutter or a needle nose pliers, you can use it to cut your wire, but what I have found is that it's easiest just to twist and bend your wire and not cut it, because sometimes it's difficult to reattach it back together after you do that. So you can see I'm forming all of the limbs and I'm leaving a little bit of extra wire for the hands and the feet. And then any leftover wire that I have, I'll just wrap around the head. The next step is pretty straightforward. I'm going to take my masking tape and wrap it around all of my wire. What this is doing is giving a little bit more body to my figure. So I don't want my figure just to look like a skinny stick figure. I want him to actually have a little bit of substance. So that's what this is doing. So I'm taking care to especially wrap a little bit of extra masking tape around the feet and the hands and the head, just because I want to make sure that he's not too scrawny. And I did give him a little bit of a belly too, just to kind of add some shape to my figure. Now comes the fun part. This is where I'm going to shape my figure into some sort of a pose. So I'm going to do a yoga pose, but you could do any type of pose that you'd like. And at some point this quarter, you'll have the option of doing a choice project. Maybe you want to plan that now to do 2 different figures, and maybe they're dancing or playing some sort of a game. It's up to you what you want to do with this, but again, I'm going to stick with a yoga pose for my figure. All right, my friends, the word of the day is armature. Armatures are used all the time in sculpture. It's basically just the foundation that an artist uses to create their piece. And that's exactly what I've created here. This is an armature. It's not finished. I'm going to cover it with Plaster Craft, but the foundation is now complete. All right, now the fun begins. We're ready to start adding Plaster Craft to our armature. So I'm going to start by moving my strips aside. I do not want to drip water all over them because what will happen is the water will dry the plaster out and they'll be all hard and crusty and nasty, and it's not very fun to work with. So once you add the Plaster Craft to your piece, you want to make sure that you smooth it out. Do you see the difference between the Plaster Craft before and after I smooth it? Before, you can see all those bumps and ridges in the gauze, and then after I smooth it out, they disappear. This is going to make your piece look so much neater if you do this step. So make sure that you smooth and smooth continually while you're creating your piece. I'm going to speed through a lot of this because I think you get the idea. You're just taking your plaster strips, dipping them in water, covering your entire piece, and smoothing it as much as possible. One thing I noticed with my figure is it didn't sit very well. It wobbled a lot. So I'm going to add a little bit more substance to his bottom just to kind of give him a little bit more stability when he sits on the table. So I folded a piece of Plaster Craft and smoothed that on, and then I took a second strip and covered that completely so it looks like it's part of his body and it didn't look like an afterthought. You can do this to any area on your figure. You can add a little bit more substance to the head or the hands or the feet, wherever you think it needs it most. All right, and then once you've completely covered your figure, take a minute, check it, make sure there's no areas that need extra plaster or that you missed, and also make sure that you smooth everything really, really well. You want to make sure you do this all in one setting. If it dries and then you try adding plaster to it later, it just doesn't stick very well. So try to smooth it out as much as you can. Try to get it completely filled in with just one setting. And then when you're all done, he needs to sit and dry completely. If you notice there's some rough areas, you can sand them down or trim them as needed.